Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
It might be charges that center around drug trafficking, but it has been a White House that is keenly focused on what happens to oil in Venezuela. For more on the fallout of Maduro's capture, we are joined now by Wilbur Ross. He served as Secretary of Commerce in the first Trump administration. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And you oversaw the Commerce Department at a time when economic policy was increasingly becoming a national security tool. With this latest action in Venezuela, what has changed? Does that become even more apparent as a tool for this administration?
Well, I think it's clear that a lot can be done and should be done to change the economics of Venezuela. Let me give you a few data points. They probably have 300 billion barrels of oil of proven reserves. At $50 a barrel, that's $15 trillion of reserves. So in terms of being able to handle the debts that they have, which are substantial, but are only 160 billion, so compare that to oil reserves well into the trillions, it should not be that big a problem. The bigger problem is that because of poor management, poor maintenance, and running out of parts, the oil production has gone down by more than 2 million barrels a day. At $50 a barrel, that works out to about $37 billion a year cost to the economy. Those are huge, huge numbers, especially when you consider the whole population is only around 27 million people, because some 7 million people have fled the country under Maduro. And it's not just oil. There's a lot else that can be fixed. For example, agriculture is 25% of the land mass of Venezuela, but it's only 3% of the economy and only 10% of the labor force. And the reason for that is that they don't have fertilizer. Their equipment, tractors and reapers and things are pretty well broken down. They need spare parts. So there's a lot of stuff that can be improved and improve pretty quickly. Agriculture, for example, could be brought back very, very fast. Venezuela had been one of the most verdant soils in all of Latin America, and it was one of the reasons why Venezuela was as popular and as prosperous as it had been.
But Wilbur, what needs to happen?
They were bringing Colombians in to help on the fields because they didn't have enough workers.
Can I just break in, Wilbur, and ask, this is your specialty. You made your name before you ran trade policy for commerce at the cabinet level, negotiating for creditors in the biggest names of bankruptcy, TWA and Texaco and Drexel Burnham Lambert. Then you obviously became the biggest restructuring expert, or one of them in the U.S., with turnarounds of massive businesses like U.S. Steel. So this is what you do. What needs to happen for capital to go into Venezuela and do the very same? What kind of stability, what kind of rule of law, what kind of prerequisites need to be met?
Right. Well, there's a lot that needs to be done. In terms of laws, Venezuela has the weakest property rights laws in the whole world. So that has to be fixed so that you have some assurance of private sector continuing ownership. But I think realistically, companies going in now in a relatively complex situation are probably going to want guarantees against expropriation. And that's not unusual. The U.S. and multinational entities often give expatriation and foreign exchange guarantees. Now, the debt structure is mind-bogglingly complicated. They have about 160 billion of debt altogether, counting expatriation claims, counting funded debt, counting debt for oil, counting everything. Those bonds have been trading in the high teens, low 20s. They could probably be restructured in the 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. So in the overall context, that's not a very big number. And one of the few good things is that the IMF has no exposure to Venezuela, and IMF is entitled to lend up to $50 billion. So they could very well be a source of some funding.
If I can just jump in on that point before we continue, Wilbur, because some of the exposure we do understand comes from China and debt owed to Chinese banks, for example. If there is a restructuring of debt in the country, do you expect the U.S. to exert force of who gets priority in the capital stack? Does it change where back payments and different restructuring comes from, just given the geopolitics of the moment between the U.S. and China?
Right. Well, both the Chinese and the Russians had made loans to Venezuela that are payable at least partly in oil, but oil at very, very advantageous prices to them. So they are part of the problem in that they're getting oil very cheaply out of Venezuela in return for debts that otherwise are never going to be paid. Now, the oil that comes out of Venezuela is mostly what we call heavy oil, and that requires a slightly different refining process from the American shale oil, which is mostly light oil. Both China and India have very strong facilities for processing heavy oil, because a lot of the Iranian oil that they had been getting also is heavy. And in the U.S., there are a number of refineries in the southern part of the country, particularly the old Citgo refineries that were established from the very beginning to handle this oil. So while it is a little bit different and it's a little more costly to refine,
right,
at anything like $50 a barrel, it's still going to be very, very cheap.
Wilbur, can I just ask?
The extraction costs in Venezuela, once you've got it up and running and with proper equipment, are going to be very, very low.
Can I just ask, Wilbur? We've only got
other natural resources.
We've only got a minute left here, and I want to ask.
Venezuela has lots of gold,
right,
most of which is not being used for lawful purposes.
Well, speaking of lawful, I just want to ask.
There have been transport planes every day flying to Iran with Venezuelan gold.
Fair. We've only got a minute left, and I just want to ask you about the precedent risk here. Does removing a sitting head of state on criminal grounds create a precedent that we have to live with later? Do other great powers now reserve that right for themselves as well?
Well, the whole situation is very complicated. I'm not close enough to what's happening on the ground to figure out exactly how to resolve the political issues. But Secretary Rubio has indicated on other television shows over the weekend that perhaps the ultimate solution to the governance of Venezuela is new elections. And if they're properly supervised, that might well be an answer.
All right, Commerce Secretary, I'm sorry to jump in. We are just up against a commercial break. Thank you so much for joining us, though. That is Wilbur Ross, former U.S. Commerce Secretary, as we assess the fallout of Nicolás Maduro's capture, who's currently on U.S. soil in New York facing trial.